Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Journey Home podcast. This is my first solo episode in a few weeks now because I've done a few collaborations with my wife Eunice, and so hopefully you've been able to catch some of those episodes. I hope you enjoyed them. I'm sure we'll do more of those in the future, but for now, I'm going back to the solo pod format, and we're actually going to be starting a new series on the book of Galatians. So if you've been following the podcast from the beginning, you might remember that I originally intended to launch the podcast back in October with a series out of the book of Galatians, and for a number of reasons I decided to switch it up at the last minute. But I feel like it's kind of come back. I've circled around back to this book and wanting to do a series out of this book because I just feel like it's particularly relevant right now. Of course, I believe that scripture is timeless. It's always relevant on one hand, but there's times where certain scriptures or certain books even seem to jump off the pages and speak into your present moment in a certain way. And I feel like, at least for me, the book of Galatians is that right now. And so yeah, we want to kick off a new series. So starting next week, I want to begin to explore the content of the book in more detail. But this week, I really mostly just want to give an introduction. And as an introduction, I'm going to share 3 reasons why I believe Paul's letter to the Galatians is particularly relevant right now. And I also just want to share just a few highlights in my own journey with this book. Um, and so I feel like I should also issue like a little disclaimer here that currently I am living in the USA, and this is my country of birth and citizenship and all that. And so when I talk about the church, I'm mostly speaking from a perspective of the church in the U.S. and but I want you to know, like, I'm well aware that God's church is way bigger than just one country, and I do keep, of course, that in the back of my mind as I'm sharing. But a lot of the observations that I share are going to be mostly related to the church of the USA, and so just wanted you to be aware of that from the beginning. Um, so let me start with some of my journey and history with this book. So many of you guys know our family lived overseas for 3.5 years. And we were there to help serve churches over there. We were over there to share the gospel with people who didn't know the Lord. And so it's just a tremendous privilege, a tremendous experience that we had. Um, and But part of that season of life, one of the things that the community that I was involved with at that time, one of the things that our leadership was constantly challenging us with was this very simple question, but just this question of what is the gospel. And it was really challenging because I think a lot of us assume we know what the gospel is, right? Especially those of us that have grown up in church or been in church for a long time or even been in ministry for a long time. It's so easy for us to assume that we know what the gospel is. But what that question forced me to struggle with is, okay, do I even know how to like boil it down in its simplest terms? Do I know how to articulate it in a way that's clear and makes sense? Um, and makes sense to someone who maybe has never heard it before, who hasn't grown up in church, right? Like, can I articulate it in that way? And then that's just the beginning. I mean, let alone, am I living my life according to the truth of the gospel? And then can I even invite someone else into that life that God gives us in Christ? Do I have the ability to bring someone else along in that journey and disciple someone else? And so it was great questions that we were being challenged with, and it was just such a formative experience for me. Um, and so then of course we move our overseas with our whole family, and if you are familiar with that, like, that is just a crazy experience in itself. I mean, it's very unsettling. You're leaving almost everything that's familiar to you and just plunging yourself into a new country, new culture, new customs, new language, new food. It can be very disorienting, very unsettling. Um, but one thing that began to happen as we lived there is that I would begin to meet and interact with, local people of that country, and at different times they'd share different experiences or interactions that they had had with Christians, but especially Christians that had come from Western countries and that had come from my country, the USA, and some of their experiences were positive, but not always. Some of them were actually pretty negative, and um, here's an interesting a principle that I've found to be very true in parenting and discipleship. Um, and you've probably heard this stated before as well. But it goes like this: you teach what you know, but you reproduce what you are. And again, that's not like necessarily Bible, but I think that those concepts are spoken of, addressed in the Bible for sure. It's not a literal Bible verse, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. Um, and teaching is important, as you need to articulate truth accurately, with precision, with clarity, with conviction. But there's a whole nother side to making disciples, in that it almost doesn't matter what you say, if you're not living it, right? And of course, none of us live the life of discipleship perfectly, but you know we are going to reproduce, what we are. If you're listening and you're a parent, you know this probably all too well. Sometimes, I'll admit, like, I look at my kids and I see, a habit that they've developed, or a way that they're acting, or an attitude that they've adopted, and I might be annoyed by it, or I might think, oh gosh, that's terrible, like, where did they learn that? And then after a few moments, I'll realize, oh my gosh, they learned that from me. I do that. I do that at times. I act that way. I have a bad attitude at times. And so it's just humbling, because you realize, like, no matter how much you tell your kids not to act a certain way or not to behave in a particular way, if you're doing it, they're probably going to pick up on it, and they're probably going to do it. And so, even as I dialogued with local, believers in our host country, or as I observed, their lives, I would begin to pick up on things and notice and say, huh, I wonder where they learned that. And, I'm talking about some of the negative things. And, similarly, I began to realize, oh, they learned that from Western believers. They learned that from, American Christians, and again, some things were positive, but some were not positive, and I remember one of the most gut punching or gut wrenching conversations I had with a local pastor in that country. Um, and this is someone who had been serving for decades, not, wasn't a new pastor, or anything. They had seen a lot of things and a lot of experience. They said, there was a time where, when we met a Christian from the U.S., like, you know, we knew that person had come here to die. And what they meant by that wasn't necessarily a literal death, but that, they were a true disciple. When Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me, like, they lived that, and if necessary, yes, they were willing to lay their life down for Jesus. But the point is that they had surrendered, and they recognized that their lives were no longer their own, but that they were there to live for God, to serve God, and that's biblical. That is the life of discipleship that we are all called to. Um, but then what the gut wrenching part of the conversation was that these pastors said to me, but we began to notice that this began to change, and at a certain point we realized that, if we were meeting a Christian who came from the U.S., they were more interested in their own comfort, or their own privileges, or their own rights, than in serving, than in laying their lives down. And that statement just totally convicted me. It broke my heart because I couldn't deny it. I knew based on my experience and what I had observed, that that was a trend that was happening. And again, it's not to say that, Christians from earlier times were perfect and this generation is so terrible. It's not that simple. But the point is that, there was an observable change in their mind, in the kind of disciples that the church of Western countries and, the church of the United States has produced. And so part of my journey was also wrestling with that question. What kind of disciples are we producing? In the American church. And just so you know, like before I went overseas, I was a pastor here in the US. And so I don't say that to be critical of pastors. If anything, I know how hard it is to pastor and to lead and to shepherd and to make disciples. And so my heart is very sympathetic toward pastors, meaning like I know the realities that we deal with on a daily basis. And so but at the same time, we are called to make disciples. And so it is a fair question to ask ourselves, what kind of disciples are we producing? I have no doubt we're producing some kind of disciples. But the question is, what kind of disciples are we producing? I think, one of the most haunting scriptures for me is what Jesus said to the Pharisees. I believe it's recorded in Matthew chapter 23. But he says, you travel, over land and sea to make a single convert. But once you gain a convert, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. And that is it's a brutal statement, from Jesus to the Pharisees. But, I think we have to hold ourselves to that standard. We have to say, like, what are we discipling people into? There's no doubt we're making disciples, but what kind of disciples? And so, I'm asking myself all these questions. What is the gospel? I'm asking myself, what kind of disciples are we producing? And then in the midst of all this, I was actually asked during my time overseas to teach at a discipleship training school. And they gave me a lot of leeway in what I wanted to teach on. And so as I prayed, as I prepared, just for a number of reasons, I ended up deciding to teach systematically through the book of Galatians. And I had never done that before. But I just decided to go for it. And so I did it. And, based on the feedback I received from the students, I think it was a blessing to them. But I have to say, like, I think I was the most blessed person in that classroom, and it's almost as if I felt like I was being saved all over again. And I don't know if that's a literal thing, but like it certainly felt that way. I feel like I was being renewed or reintroduced, I should say, to the truth of the gospel all over again. And it was just so powerful and so transformative. And so, those are just a few highlights from my own journey with this letter to the Galatians. So now I want to share just 3 reasons why I think this book is particularly timely right now. So my first one is that it reminds us that any of us can stray from the true gospel, right? If you're familiar with this letter, the main purpose Paul's writing it is to correct and warn the Galatian church because, from his vantage point, they have strayed from the gospel that he originally preached to them, and they have begun following something that, he says is a different gospel. But what he means by that, it's not that, there's, multiple versions of the gospel that are all valid. That's not his point. His point is that, if it's a different gospel, it's not a gospel at all. It's you've veered off the path of life. And so that's the main purpose Paul writes this letter. But there's obviously there's a historical context for that letter, but there's a message that I think any believer at any point in history can take away from it, which is that any of us can stray at any point. We should not assume that just because we've been in church for 20 years or we've even been in ministry for 20 years, that we can't stray. None of us are immune from this. If the Galatians could stray, than any of us can. Like, I mean, this is a church that was founded and established by the Apostle Paul. Like, if there's any church that shouldn't struggle, it's probably one of these churches. And yet, they were vulnerable and we're vulnerable too. And sometimes we just need that wake up call. We need someone to challenge us and say, hey, are you sure you haven't strayed from the true gospel? And hopefully you haven't, but it's good to be challenged in that way. I just can't imagine how jarring it must have been for the believers in Galatia to receive this letter, because they're just chugging along. They're living their life. They probably think they're doing a good job, and being faithful to Jesus. And then all of a sudden they get this letter from Paul that's almost like a slap in the face. It's like, oh gosh, have we strayed? Are we deceived? Um, and sometimes we all need that. And I think, personally, I believe that we're in that kind of a moment, at least in the United States, for the church. You look at um, all the scandals, all the leaders that are falling away, or their abuses are being exposed. You look at all the questions that are being asked of the church right now, and you could tell yourself that we're being persecuted, but I personally believe it's God trying to wake us up and get our attention. And it's for the purpose so that we can get on the right path. It's not to punish us, it's not to shame us, but it's to call us back to the path, because we have, in my view, strayed from the path in a significant way. And so, this is our time for that wake up call. And so that's one reason why I think the book of Galatians is so timely, even right now. My second reason is because this book reminds us of what the gospel actually is, and also what it isn't. Sometimes we learn what something is by talking about what it isn't. And I think that happens in this book, and it's helpful. I think there's confusion right now in the church about what the gospel really is. I think there are things that we like to call the gospel that I would say are not the gospel at all. Um, and I think, you know, again, I think we need to be reminded about what the gospel is. Sometimes I think we're so obsessed with talking about what grace isn't that we forget what it is, and what the gospel isn't. But we forget what the gospel is. And so I think it's a fair question to ask every leader right now, every believer right now, if we actually, if the gospel that we're preaching, if the gospel that we're teaching, if the gospel that we're trying to live is the actual gospel. I think it's a fair question. I think it's a good time to ask that question. And then finally, my third point is that it calls us back to a life that is centered in the gospel, a life that is marked by grace, that's marked by freedom, it's a life by the Spirit, as Paul says. It calls us back to that. And that's so important because it's, in some circles, of the church, it's easy for us to kind of make the gospel just this theoretical, philosophical thing, but it doesn't end up, we don't always attach it to the real life outworkings of it in our day-to-day life. And, the Apostle Paul's really good at that. On one hand, he'll talk about deep, theological realities, these massive cosmic concepts, that are just so profound and so lofty. And yet at the same time, in the same letter, he always manages to tie it back to just real life, real day-to-day life, very practical. And the truth is we need both of those things. It's not one or the other. We don't have to pick and choose. We need both of those things. This gospel contains both of those things. And I would say the church in America, we need both of those things. We need the deep theological realities, but then also, okay, then what does that mean for my day-to-day, life? And so it calls us back to that life as well. And so anyway, this is all just to serve as an introduction to this new series. Again, I think it's very timely. I think the book of Galatians raises a lot of great questions that we need to be having, that we need to be considering in our day and in our time. And so hopefully you will join me for these episodes, and I hope that it serves as a blessing to you and challenges you. Um, so yeah, we will continue next week. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.